Hey guys, welcome to another live about KMT and their interest in Tibet right before they were defeated. So, in terms of how usually people study history, it's like everyone knows what happened in the end, right? But then the details really interest me, a different world altogether. Because growing up, I've never met or like seriously discussed with any of the elders who were part of the KMT. That's just my background. And then recently I read this super long article about this guy who actually went to jail for 33 years because his father was a KMT official. The article's tone is very somber. It's not like he hated the people who jailed him, but still it felt like he didn't regret anything. So I was kind of confused why this operation was on such a massive scale, but then still people had no problem at all going to jail and just eating gruel. Not even rice. The diet was terrible and there was no shower available for prisoners. Anyways, here's a short graph of what we're about to get into. The different actors, spies, Chiang Kai-shek clique, the Sera Monastery debacle, Kampa traders, and British interests in India. In 1947, some Tibetans representing the official Lhasa government went to India and they were successful in proclaiming that they were like an autonomous body. Tibetans were also invited to attend the National Assembly in 1948, but then they declined the invitation. The nationalist government in reality viewed the mission with apprehension, and their dealings with it were paradoxical. The Chinese welcomed any positive gesture that would strengthen ties between Nanjing and Lhasa. Yet, on the other hand, Nanjing feared that the Tibetans would use their official visit to the West to erode the Chinese position that Tibet was part of China. According to Chinese archives, Nanjing's bottom line with regards to the mission visits to the United States and Britain was that they must use Chinese passports, or at least one or two nationalist officials must accompany them in order to supervise the Tibetan activities in those countries. Not surprisingly, the Tibetans would not accept either of these terms. While still in Nanjing, they approached the British embassy requesting that the British government issue them visas in their Tibetan passports. Keeping this matter strictly confidential, the British eventually agreed. In June 1948, the Tibetans left China for Hong Kong. During their short stay there, the mission made the same request to the American Consul General, who consented to stamp visas in the Tibetan passports. Before the Tibetans' departure from China, Nanjing officials were informed by the Tibetan mission that due to the insoluble passport and visa problems, it had decided to return to Lhasa via Hong Kong and India. When the news reached Nanjing that the Tibetans were in fact continuing their travels to the United States and Britain on their own passports, however, the Chinese realized that they had been duped and became enraged. Protests were conveyed to the American embassy in Nanjing without delay, and in Washington, Chinese ambassador Dr. Wellington Koo also expressed outrage. The State Department immediately backed down by informing the Chinese that there was no change of policy regarding Tibet and that the United States had already decided to treat the Tibetans only in an unofficial manner. At the same time, the nationalist government also protested to the British, requesting that London withhold British visas from the Tibetans until the Tibetans had produced Chinese passports. The British government gave in. The Foreign Office admitted that there was a technical error on part of the British embassy in Nanjing in issuing visas for Tibetan passports, although the British also indicated that it was never London's practice to stop a worthy individual from traveling or to take sides by insisting on the production of a national passport. The nationalist government had thus been able to secure some diplomatic guarantees over China's position in Tibet, both from Washington and London, and had saved a little face. Nevertheless, the Tibetans had succeeded in demonstrating their country's de facto independence to the whole world. During their stay in the United States, the Tibetans managed to meet General Marshall, Secretary of State George Marshall, on August 6th without any Chinese escort. Nanjing was convinced that during their stay in Washington, the Tibetans had managed only to meet some low-profile officials from the U.S. Department of Commerce. With respect to the purchase of gold, the Tibetans almost achieved their goal when the United States agreed to sell the Tibet the gold it wanted. This decision was another tentative indication of a willingness to recognize Tibet as a sovereign state. An embarrassing moment occurred, however, when the Tibetan government found that it had no dollars for purchasing gold, since the proceeds of all its external sales had been converted into Indian rupees banked by the government of India. Knowing that India would be greatly reluctant to release the necessary hard currency, the mission instead sought a possible loan from the U.S. government. Washington refused to go along with this proposal, considering such a loan as an act of political recognition much larger than just the sale of gold. Having concluded its business in the United States, the Tibetan Trade Mission then headed to the UK in November 1948. In London, the Tibetans achieved some diplomatic success when they were granted audience without the escort of any Chinese diplomats by Prime Minister Attlee, Deputy Foreign Minister Mayhew, and the Lord Chamberlain on behalf of King George. Yet apart from these courtesy calls, officials in London were cautious not to offer any overt support for Tibetan claims that Tibet was independent of China, and decided not to discuss political issues with their Tibetan guests. The mission also failed to secure British support for their financial and economic agenda. The British government refused to make pound sterling available to the Tibetans, and was only willing to persuade the government of India to reconsider the hard currency issue that had disturbed the Lhasa authorities. After 3 weeks in London, the Tibetan mission returned to India in December 1948 at a time when the days of nationalist rule in China were numbered. The ultimate goal for the Tibetan government was to seek complete independence. High-degree autonomy never became a real basis for post-war Sino-Tibetan negotiations. Moreover, as this study has revealed, Chiang Kai-shek's last Tibetan resolution remained controversial and was still open to question within the KMT regime itself. And perhaps even more significant was that will be discussed soon, Nanjing's policy of associating with the existing Lhasa government in the post-war period prevented the nationalists from supporting a coup d'etat launched by Tibetan pro-Chinese factions in the spring of 1947. The nationalist government thus lost their one and only chance during the whole nationalist era to control this region effectively. Despite massive American armaments entrusted to Chiang Kai-shek and his regime, the Civil War did not go well for them. By the summer of 1947, the communists had seized most of Manchuria, and toward the end of the year, nationalist forces had been entirely ousted from that area. Encumbered by the deteriorating situation in China proper, the KMT war victory regime had become a passive actor in Tibetan issues during the closing years of the post-war interregnum. Facing a series of efforts by Lhasa to promote Tibet's international visibility, Nanjing could do nothing more than continuously insist on its theoretical sovereignty over Tibet and direct diplomatic protests to those who had received the Tibetan mission in the world. It therefore became obvious that the ailing nationalist government was desperately utilizing its vanishing diplomatic capabilities to grasp for international recognition of China's position in Tibet. This farewell gesture of the nationalists produced far-reaching consequences in contemporary Chinese history. It offered the new communist regime a legitimate excuse to send its PLA, People's Liberation Army, troops in 1950 to enter one piece of China's territory in order to liberate the people inhabiting this region. The Tibetan issue thereafter entered another stage, one that is beyond the scope of this research. Chapter 10. Sera Monastery Incident. Concerning this incident, this is a quote, "So far, only 3 telegrams have been dispatched from the central government, to which the Tibetan government turns a deaf ear and pays no heed. Han Chinese sympathizers here are rather dissatisfied with the disposition of the central government and think that it will be 1,000 times more difficult to solve the Tibetan question after Taktra is one of the people's names, entirely eradicates Tibetan pro-Han factions. It is my perception that the central government is willing neither to dispatch troops to introduce calm, nor to make any political gestures with respect to the incident. Thus, in the future, government officials working in Tibet will no longer be able to secure a foothold here." In the spring of 1947, while China's national focus was primarily on intensifying KMT-CCP warfare in northeast and north China, an abortive coup took place in Tibet, the remotest southwestern corner of China's theoretical domain. In January of that year, a small parcel was delivered by an unknown man to the house of a confidant of the Taktra rinpoche, the regent of Tibet. The parcel was forgotten until some weeks later when a house member opened it and found what he described as a round metal object on a curved rack. This object began to tick like a clock and then exploded. The Tibetan government's primary suspect was the ex-regent Radrang Hutuktu, who was strongly believed to be conspiring against Taktra's rule. On 14th April, the monastery connected to Radrang, together with the houses of a few other suspects, were sealed off by the Lhasa authorities. The suspects, including Radrang and other ex-officials, were arrested shortly afterward. 2 days later, 16th April, the monks of Sera Monastery, with which the Radrang Hutuktu was closely affiliated, declared their support for the ex-regent. They murdered their abbot and other Taktra-appointed monasterial officials, and throughout the following days posed a critical challenge to the Lhasa authorities. Joined by monks from other places, the Sera monks armed themselves and then moved to a ridge where they came under fire from the government's mountain guns. Talks were opened unsuccessfully between the Sera Monastery and Lhasa government. Further bombardment from Lhasa followed. On 26 April, the Taktra regime made a determined attack and killed a large number of the rebellious monks, compelling most of the others to surrender. Meanwhile, an investigation of the charges against Radrang and his suspected associates, who, according to the Tibetan government, later admitted their involvement in the conspiracy, had been initiated. It was also alleged that the Radrang Khotoktu had been in touch with the KMT regime, which had secretly supported this conspiracy against the Taktra administration. On 8th May 1947, the ex-regent died in prison from